Way to go, Billy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise in this House. I thank my colleague for sharing his time with me. For 10 years now, the Liberal government has made our country weaker with overspending, deficit after deficit. Through this Liberal government, the promotion of government dependency in regards to economic development has become the staple and the identity of Canada, especially in Indigenous economic development. The current projection for the Liberal government deficit for this year alone is anywhere from $60 billion to $100 billion. Indigenous peoples and Canadians have questions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, why is it that this government, year after year, gets to spend recklessly, billions and billions over budget with little to no plan, but enforces, through the Indian Act and Indigenous Services Canada, financial and management penalties if First Nations go over budget? Wow. Why is it First Nations get enforced upon them default and third-party management for one challenging fiscal year, but this Liberal government gets to put Canada in debt to the tune of trillions of dollars and have billions of dollars in annual deficits? Maybe this government, led by the supposedly brilliant banker, should be subject to the same penalties it enforces upon First Nations.
That's right.
Really good.
Rules for thee, not for me, it seems, when it comes to this government. These deficits have cost 86,000 net job losses alone in our country. Indigenous unemployment and youth unemployment have combined to exclude an entire generation of young Indigenous workers from contributing to Canada's economy.
Sad.
Deficits hurt community workers, frontline workers, teachers, health aides, and First Nations communities see their pay stagnant while living costs soar. Just like the rest of rural Canada, we already struggle to recruit teachers, social workers, healthcare workers, and other frontline staff needed in our communities. Ottawa's reckless spending doesn't lift up Indigenous workers. It pushes them out of the workforce through affordability pressures and housing shortages. Indigenous Canadian unemployment is exacerbated by the Liberal mismanagement of immigration and temporary foreign workers. For years, we've had workers in the Indigenous communities wanting their chance to contribute to the local economies in rural Canada and urban centres, but they feel left out and forgotten by Liberal mismanagement. It is time to put Canada first, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are scared of job losses and how they're going to put food on the table and pay the bills. Food inflation above the Bank of Canada's target is not abstract. It means $15 milk in northern community stores, families choosing between gas and groceries, and higher costs for traditional foods and supplies. People accessing rural grocery stores were hit hard with both rising food costs, cost of fuel to get them to and from their reserve communities. Rising fuel and transportation costs erode band budgets, forcing leaders to cut community programs or delay infrastructure maintenance. Rising costs force chief and councils to choose between healthcare and social supports. This has exacerbated housing shortages, access to clean drinking water, increased maintenance costs for public service vehicles, increased preventable costs for that Indigenous communities and Canadians continue to pay for later. Increased costs of living hit Indigenous post-secondary students hard with costs to study and increased costs to housing, for travel, and to meet cultural and family obligations. Indigenous students are a part of the record lineups at food banks. The treaty right to education funding has been getting watered down under this Liberal government. These are our future leaders, Mr. Speaker, that are falling behind the rest of Canada. Indigenous communities continue to struggle in this Liberal deficit environment to create and sustain their own source revenue initiatives today, Mr. Speaker. When the dollar weakens and borrowing costs rise, First Nations' own source revenues and trust funds lose value. Inflation cancels out Indigenous progress. Every gain from new businesses, training programs, economic partnerships is swallowed by higher costs. Local Indigenous entrepreneurs are priced out of equipment loans, procurement opportunities, youth training programs face cost overruns with no adjustment in funding. $53.9 billion leaving Canada for the United States means fewer partnerships for Indigenous-led projects. Energy, food security, natural resources, mines, operations, tourism ventures struggle to attract investors. Real reconciliation requires capital staying in Canada to grow Indigenous economies, not capital fleeing, with the government trying to play hero by making federal tax dollars the focus for economic development for our communities. Indigenous nations just want the government to get out of the way, Mr. Speaker, so we can create our own economies alongside the rest of Canadians. Ottawa's deficits raise interest rates, which raise borrowing costs for First Nations and Indigenous development corporations, making self-financing more challenging or near impossible. The promise of reconciliation through economic inclusion rings hollow when inflation eats away at every grant dollar and makes Indigenous infrastructure 30 to 40% higher and more expensive to build. What Indigenous prosperity needs instead is fiscal discipline that makes every dollar count, targeted investments, not blanket deficits, stable inflation so Indigenous nations can plan multi-year housing and infrastructure builds without surprise cost escalations, true partnerships where Indigenous communities direct investment to local priorities, not to Ottawa's vote-buying announcements, economic reconciliation grounded in accountability, stability, and productivity, not recycled liberal talking points. Mr. Speaker, the traditions of First Nations people often sit around not taking more than what you need, not wasting one part of the buffalo or the moose that we hunt to sustain us. Sustainability, Mr. Speaker. This aligns with the principle of balancing our budget and eliminating our deficits. This aligns with our values as Indigenous people. When I became chief of my nation, oil prices were down, and that affected our local economy. We projected an $8 million deficit, or 10% overspending, for my First Nation alone. We had overdependence on band office jobs. We had very little in terms of external investment confidence in our Enoch Nation. We knew we had to make tough fiscal decisions and really do the work to restore investor confidence, our membership confidence, to have good governance in our First Nation and have a real plan to grow and diversify our economy. So we created our first financial law, which holds our Enoch government accountable to how it spends, made ourselves investable again, which resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of economic development on and off our reserve for our members and for Albertans. Fantastic. We invested our natural resource sector and partnered to build the first greenfield large-scale natural gas power plant in a generation in Alberta. We grew business, entrepreneurship, focused less on government-dependent jobs. We became stronger. We readily partner with other First Nations and Indigenous communities to make everybody else stronger as well. When the government says Canada's strong, I think they really need to reflect on the fact that deficits make Canada weaker. We think in 7 generations in our Indigenous communities. This government seems to only be adding 7 generations of debt and burden to our future generations as all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Carleton.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech. If so, do you see a role in the federal government making targeted investments to improve the economic prospects and future of Indigenous Canadians?
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, I thank the member for his question, and he implicated, does the government need to make targeted investments in First Nations and Indigenous economies? I thank him for that question, but also I would say I rephrase that. What we need is the government to get out of the way. We've always known how to run our own economies. We've always known how to stand on our own 2 feet.
That's right.
And we need the government actually to get out of the way so we can get rid of red tape. We can get rid of the Indian Act. We can get rid of these different policies that are being upheld still by this Liberal government today to actually build Canada and put Canada first so we can have this economy back on track.
Way to go, Billy!
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires de l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Shefford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his speech. He spoke a lot about the importance of a nation-to-nation relationship and projects by and for Indigenous people. Last year, I met a group who came to me to talk about the Yanoshia project. I might not be pronouncing it right, but this was a program asking for $150 million, which would be provided to projects that would offer affordable capital and facilitate access to housing in the community. It was a project that could have been by and for Indigenous people. I would like to hear him speak about the importance of funding these sorts of initiatives.
Northwest.
Well, again, I thank the honourable member for her question. And certainly government does have a role in investing in housing for First Nations communities. Federal jurisdiction dictates that First Nations in particular have to work directly with the government and not necessarily the provincial government first or municipalities. But again, Mr. Speaker, I highlight that again, we have the resources. Many of our communities are rural, right next to the biggest forests in Canada. In BC, we have First Nations ready to invest in softwood lumber to build homes in First Nations communities. But again, on the bigger picture, I'm really disappointed in the government and how they're downplaying and harming these bigger, larger industries in the bigger picture and not allowing First Nations to step forward in those partnerships to build homes on reserve.
Good question.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Skeena, Bulkley Valley.
Incredible speech regarding deficits. And I think the Liberals missed the point of what he said. And I was in that humiliating situation of remedial management and third-party management. And it is very humiliating for 1 year of unmanageable deficits. Very humiliating. That's why I went after an economic base. But to my colleague, what is third-party management, and what would happen if Canada was subject to the same rules that many First Nations chief and councillors are subject to?
Good question.
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
I thank the honourable member for his question. Third-party management is an ISC policy and stipulation that if the government, and rightfully so, if you cannot spend your dollars right, I think you do need oversight. And it is humiliating for First Nations, and sometimes humility is a part of what we do as First Nations. But if this applied to Canada, we wouldn't have 10 years of deficits. We wouldn't have trillions externally going to the other countries. And if Canada was held accountable to the same rate that they hold First Nations accountable, this country would be better off, in a better off situation. Sovereignty wouldn't be harmed, and we would be on the path to prosperity.
Good.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member from Madawaska, Restigouche.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the speech. I had the opportunity of getting together with Indigenous leaders from my riding, and we talked about housing in our community. It is a significant issue, and with federal investment and with rapid housing initiatives, more than $10 million have been invested in the community since 2023. Now, does my colleague agree with me in saying that this is a great news and response to the needs of the community? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Edmonton Northwest.
Well, certainly, I think that, again, that since First Nations and Indigenous communities are so far behind, investments into housing are always good. But again, I would implore the government to think on it bigger, not just subsidies, not just social housing. Those are good things, and those are things that are going to be needed in Indigenous communities and all Canadian communities, for example, for the rest of the time. But I would also say there's a market housing, and First Nations can get rid of the Indian Act stipulations that go against mortgages on reserve, and that's something else we need to focus and create the space for them to build their own housing.
Yeah.